Would like to say welcome again and thank you for all joining this Twitter space today on ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray. Today's discussion is being moderated by Human Rights Watch's European Media Director, Andrew Stroline, and I am now going to turn it over to Andrew, who will introduce our guests and start off our conversation.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. Good. I think everybody can hear me. Yes, I'd like to welcome everyone to this conversation as well. We're going to be talking about ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray, Ethiopia. For the next hour or so, we're going to be talking specifically about the new report published last week by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. We've been promoting this Twitter space now for several days, and we've been asking people to send in their questions for our experts, and we've honestly seen an overwhelming response. We've received hundreds of questions and comments, and we've decided to structure basically this entire space around your questions. So we had questions on the methodology used in the research. We had questions on the recommendations we've given in the report, and questions about why we call this an ethnic cleansing rather than a genocide. And we had questions on the failures of the international community. So really, we've taken these questions and put them together to give us a basic path forward for this conversation that we'll have here. I have three experts with me today, so I'm going to introduce them quickly, and then we'll get started. So in order of speaking, first we have Jean-Baptiste Galopin, who's a researcher with Amnesty International's crisis response team. We have Fisaha Tekle, a researcher on the Horn of Africa at Amnesty International. We have Letitia Bader, director for the Horn of Africa at Human Rights Watch. So let's get started. Jean-Baptiste, we'll come to you. Could you give us an overview of the report? And maybe for those of us and our listeners who are maybe a bit less familiar with the region, could you maybe say a little bit about the context and the situation in the region in the lead up to the time period that we're covering here? Jean-Baptiste.
Thank you, Andrew, and good to be with you all. Our report found, first I'll just give a brief overview of what we found. So since the start of the war in Tigray in November 2020, we found that the authorities in Western Tigray zone, as well as officials and security forces from the Amhara region, targeted Tigrayan civilians in a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign, using crimes that represent crimes against humanity and war crimes. And these were carried out at times with the acquiescence and the possible participation of Ethiopian federal forces. In total, hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans have been forcibly removed from Western Tigray, and it's really been a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. And this campaign has been largely hidden from the world. The federal and regional authorities have deliberately blocked access to independent humanitarian, human rights, and media groups, and they've also prevented communities seeking to flee from doing so. As a result, many actors around the conflict, such as humanitarians and diplomats, had no clear insights on the magnitude of the suffering and the needs of the community of the region. Western Tigray has been the site of tensions over the boundaries and the identity of the territory, tensions which have simmered for decades. It's long been the site of abuses of human rights. Claims over the identity of the territory were violently suppressed by the Tigray regional authorities, and the takeover of the zone by the Amhara regional authorities in November 2020 in many ways represents a violent reversal of changes to Ethiopia's contested international boundaries. The status of Western Tigray is now at the core, really a core issue at the heart of the ongoing armed conflict. The abuses occurred in several phases that we documented in our research. The first phase was around the initial offensive of government and allied forces, which was a roughly 10-day to 2-week period during which the Ethiopian federal and allied forces indiscriminately shelled towns and villages in the area. They extrajudicially killed civilians, including those suspected of sympathizing with the TPLF, and the forces also carried out widespread looting. in a place called Division near Dansha town. Accounts from witnesses and satellite imagery show entire villages destroyed. In the course of this report, we took an in-depth look at what unfolded in Maikadra, the first publicly documented large-scale killing in the conflict. And we found that events there owed largely to pre-existing tensions among residents and laborers, which rose sharply in November as news of abuses by Ethiopian and allied forces against Tigrayans in other parts of Western Tigray reached the town. Residents and few militias were left to maintain security, and Tigrayan youths carried out house-to-house searches. And by November 9, opportunistic looting by Tigrayan businesses sparked the arrest of Amhara residents and targeted attacks against Amharas. Tigrayan men and boys beat, stabbed, and hacked with knives and machetes, mainly Amhara victims. And at one point in the evening, both sides committed violence as armed Amharas also began to attack Tigrayan in the town, with Tigrayan residents also shot and killed. The next day, on November 10th, 2020, after federal and allied forces captured the town, Tigrayan residents were targeted in a brutal wave of revenge killings, detentions, and pillage. And the abuses culminated in the eventual mass expulsion of Tigrayans from a makeshift detention site in late December 2020. And these patterns of abuses against Tigrayans, including prolonged detention, pillage, mass expulsion, would repeat in the month that followed in several towns across the zone. A second phase was from November 2020 till June 2021, in which towns of Western Tigray came under the control of federal and allied forces, and Tigrayan women and girls were subjected to horrific acts of sexual violence. And Tigrayans at large in the area were subjected to other abuse, such as the mass and prolonged detention, continued looting and pillage, and a whole series of restrictions on movement and access to farmland, and a ban of speaking Tigrinya, the language of Tigrayans, as well as the denial of humanitarian aid on Tigrayans. And so, altogether, these really made it impossible for Tigrayans to live in the area. I mean, among the restrictions, for example, were new ID cards, which were necessary to move around town, access services, or raise complaints. And there were threats and ultimatums issued to Tigrayans in several towns across Western Tigray. Words such as Tigrayans should leave, Tigrayans don't belong here, Tigrayans belong east of the Tekeze River, which really revealed a coordinated planning and purpose in their removal. In a town called Adegoshu, next to the Tekeze River, on the 17th of January 2021, Fano militias and local Welkate and Amhara residents rounded up men, and Amhara special forces took 60 of them to the river, the Tekeze River, and summarily executed them that same day in what residents believed to be a revenge attack after Amhara special forces suffered losses near the river. That really precipitated a mass exodus of Adegoshu. And during that phase, Amhara authorities and local authorities coordinated buses to organize the forced expulsion of Tigrayans east of the Tekeze River. Tigrayans who were in detention were also forcibly displaced around that time, and we estimate that hundreds of thousands of people arrived between January and March 2021. Then I'll briefly deal with the third and fourth phase. The third phase was the summer last year, when a new wave of persecution against remaining Tigrayans followed a renewed conflict, as after Tigrayan forces recaptured many parts of Tigray. In Humera, the authorities issued an ultimatum to Tigrayans to leave, and carried out sweeping arrests of Tigrayan by the thousands. In just one place, the Enda Yetbarek warehouse, former detainees said that between 3,000 and 4,500 people were detained in just this sorghum, the storage warehouse. Tigrayans were tortured and deprived of adequate food, water, medical care, and often dying as a result of their conditions of detention. Around that time, there were also bodies that started to float down the river, the Tekeze River, which passes through Humera, and these bodies arrived in Sudan. And by November 2021, there were 136 bodies that had arrived, often with restraints and signs of gunshot wounds or injuries with sharp objects, which indicated that they had likely be killed in detention. And residents from Humera told us about people being taken out of detention sites and never seen again, people being extrajudicially killed inside or outside formal detention sites, and a fourth wave, and these conditions of detention sharply deteriorated in the second half of 2021, where people who escaped the detention sites told us that many people were dying in detention from killings, tortured, lack of food, lack of medical care. And just one person, for example, told me that he was held in a prison in Humera with 200 people in a cell that was approximately 13 square meters, and that 7 people died in that cell in 3 months of his detention. And that's just one cell of one detention site. In November, we saw a fourth wave of abuse, November, December. In early November, Fanos and Eritrean military surrounded a church where Tigrayans were celebrating in the town of Adibai and arrested thousands of men, shooting at those who tried to escape or attacking them with knives or machetes, and killing an unknown number of them. A few weeks later, the Amhara forces rounded up the women, the pregnant women, the mothers, people with older people and people with disabilities, and loaded them onto trucks in Humera, Rawian, and Adibai, and carried 29,000 of them, according to UN estimates, east of the Tekeze River. I'll briefly touch upon the roles of the Ethiopian and Eritrean military in these abuses. As I mentioned, in the initial phase of the conflict, Ethiopian federal forces carried out war crimes, including indiscriminate shelling on the towns and villages and extrajudicial executions of civilians and suspected TPLF sympathizers. The ENDF came together with allied forces from the Amhara region, going from town to town, and managed to control Western Tigray, within a period of 10 days. They were present in the area during the ethnic cleansing campaign, and at times have allowed Tigrayan communities in Western Tigray to suffer. They participated in abuses alongside Amhara security forces, and actively at times carried out acts of violence that drove Tigrayans to flee. So they coordinated with Amhara security forces and authorities. For instance, in Humera, there is a command post, which is a decision-making body that brings together the Ethiopian military as well as Amhara and local civilian authorities and Amhara special forces as well as militias. The federal military was also involved in torture, in gang rape, and in roundups, for instance, in Humera in the summer of 2021. When it comes to the Eritrean military, they were involved in looting as well as rape. But unlike other parts of Tigray, we found that in Western Tigray, they did not play a significant role in carrying out abuses against the Tigrayan populations in Western Tigray, with the exception maybe of the roundups in Adibai on the 3rd of November 2021, when they surrounded the church where Tigrayan men were arrested. We can discuss maybe these events a bit further.
Sure.
So I'll leave it at there for now.
Okay. Just Jean-Baptiste, if I could just a quick follow-up or two. You just mentioned we're talking about a number of forces committing these crimes. Amhara regional security forces, civilian authorities, federal forces, Eritrean forces. I mean, this is a pretty big set of coordinated operations. Do we have a sense of a primary mover, or are these all just forces that are kind of in a coalition and there's not a single top-down kind of arrangement?
We are naming. It's very clear from the patterns of abuses, the statements made by perpetrators, as well that the ethnic cleansing campaign was a coordinated operation. The authorities, local authorities, held meetings discussing, sometimes very early on in December, in Humera, for instance, the authorities held meetings in which they discussed their agenda of ethnic cleansing. They said that Tigrayans should leave east of the Tekeze River. There were also notices that were put on administrative buildings that gave Tigrayans an ultimatum to leave, sometimes under the threat of death within 24, 72 hours. And there were also pamphlets that were distributed giving ultimatums to Tigrayans to leave. When it comes, when it comes to, for instance, the Tekeze massacre, on 17th of January 2021, this was carried out by, after there were roundups across the city. Then, some of the prisoners were put onto trucks by Amhara Special Forces, then brought to the river, then shot. And, in the following days, there were meetings in which, the Amhara Special Force commander there, Colonel Dejene Maru, told Tigrayans, they would pay the price if there were attacks on Amhara forces. So a very clear instance of threats that testify to the fact that these attacks against civilians, where these extrajudicial killings were retaliatory in nature.
Mm-hmm.
A last thing I'd like to bring is, we do name some individuals in this report. And we call for them to face judicial proceedings for the crimes detailed in the report. And that includes Colonel Demeke Zewdu, who is the deputy administrator of the zone and the head of security in the zone, the commander Dejene Maru, who is the Amhara Special Force commander in Adegoshu, and also an intelligence officer named Bele, who was identified by witnesses as coordinating Fano militias in Humera and Adibai, carrying out intelligence, investigative, and interrogation work in the detention sites, and also involved in torture.
And just one last quick question, because I'm not sure I understood the force. So you're talking about forcible transfers of tens of thousands of people. So where are they all now? Are they in Sudan? Are they east of the Tekeze River? Are they in both places? And how many are still in detention? Do we suspect?
So in Sudan, there are roughly 50,000 people who have been displaced there. And, that was primarily during the first few weeks of the conflict, because starting in December 2020, the federal military was present on the border and prevented people from crossing the border into Sudan. The efforts to prevent Tigrayans from leaving were pretty systematic. There were checkpoints on the roads, and Tigrayans who were traveling westwards were either sent back or detained. And on the border, particularly, late last year, Tigrayans were telling us that, they were shot on sight whenever they tried to cross the border. So there are roughly 50,000 people in Sudan. In other parts of Tigray, we estimate there's approximately 700,000 people who were displaced from Western Tigray. They make up the majority of the internally displaced people in other parts of Tigray. And these figures, by the way, are figures from an assessment from the interim administration of Tigray, which was present in the area until May last year. And June, sorry. And so these are the rough estimates of the number of people who've been displaced. It's over 700,000. Okay. When it comes to the detention sites, we estimate that there are thousands of people who are still detained in both formal and informal detention sites in the area around Humera. And in our report, we documented the detention conditions there in quite some depth, and we've also have a map of all the detention sites in the Humera area.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste. I want to turn now to Fisaha and the methodology question. I think we received on Twitter more questions about how we went about this, because as we say in the report ourselves, the Ethiopian authorities have severely restricted access to this region. Independent scrutiny has been difficult, and they really have been doing everything they can to keep this campaign of ethnic cleansing hidden. So, Fisaha, what did we do to get this research, and how did we go about it?
Thank you, Andrew. It was not an easy research, as you have said. We didn't have physical access, even if both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International asked for access since the start of the conflict to do a human rights investigation in Tigray and other places. Those requests were not
Oops, I think we. Hello, are you there, Fisat? Sorry. I think we may have lost him. Oh, okay. Well, while we're waiting to get him back, I was having a very bad signal, and then he just dropped off the call here with us. So we'll try to get him back and see how we can do with that. We'll come back to the question of methodology in a little bit, and we'll turn now to my colleague Letitia to follow on from after what we found to be happening and after we did this research. Letitia, could you talk us through the recommendations that we're making? I mean, based on what we found, what do we think should be happening now? What are we asking? Who are we asking to do what?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, you know, what's very clear is that communities in Western Tigray cannot be held hostage to political negotiations that could take months, if not years, to deal with. So, as Jean-Baptiste was just describing, I mean, we have immediate concerns for the hundreds, if not thousands, of predominantly boys and men who are still in detention in Western Tigray as we speak. So, one of the key recommendations is that there needs to be robust, protection-led international humanitarian presence in Western Tigray. Humanitarian organizations need to have access to detention facilities. I mean, in the course of the research, especially since last summer, we were increasingly documenting worsening conditions in detention and including deaths in detention, both as a result of the inadequate and denial of basic needs in these facilities, but also as a result of torture. And even in the last wave of detentions in November last year, we were again documenting cases of individuals dying in detention. So immediate needs there. But at the same time, I mean, the government is going to need to rein in these abusive forces. This is the federal government which is going to need to do this. And so we have a whole range of recommendations around what needs to happen there. There needs to be a demobilizing and demilitarization of the FANO and other militias who have been implicated in these serious abuses. At the same time, federal government and Amhara regional forces who have been implicated in these serious crimes need to be suspended, as do interim officials who have been implicated. I mean, it's absolutely clear to us that they cannot be in a position to commit more abuses. As Jean-Baptiste mentioned...
Let me, Letitia, if I can just interrupt for a second. And this may be a hard question, but so excuse me, but who does that? Who makes that call and makes those calls to disband or suspend those groups?
I mean, this is absolutely where the ball is in the court of the federal government forces. You know, information has been coming out for a year, even more on what are the grave crimes we are documenting here in much more detail than has been put in the public domain till now. And what we've seen again and again is denials of the severity of these crimes. But these are crimes which have happened on the territory of the federal government. And this is their responsibility to ensure that forces that have been implicated in these serious abuses not only can no longer commit these abuses, but are also, through a whole range of measures, being held to account. I mean, as Jean-Baptiste mentioned, there are 3 individuals in particular we would like to see immediately investigated for both command responsibility and direct involvement in the abuses we document here.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just also trying to get Fisaha back as a speaker. I see he's back in the call. Can we make him a speaker? Marianne, is that possible? We're working on that. Okay. Oops, and now maybe he's dropped off again.
I mean, maybe while we wait, I mean, I think it's important
please.
to yes. I mean, you know, one of the issues that came up again and again with interviews with the survivors of this organized ethnic cleansing campaign was many do want to be able to return one day. But right now, we are not talking about a remotely conducive environment in which that can happen. And so a lot of our recommendations in the report are also thinking about both immediate protection needs, but also what can be put in place so that communities in this region can live safely. And those who have been, and we are talking about hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced as part of this organized campaign. I mean, as Jean-Baptiste described, we had both forced expulsions directly from centers of detention. The first forced expulsion started in December 2020, but we saw this happening in many towns that we document in this report throughout the last 16 months we document. But at the same time, there were also coerced expulsions of individuals. And so we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are, over the last year plus, have been forced to leave their homes. And so this is where it is absolutely key that the international and regional actors start pressing warring parties to ensure that these communities are able to safely return. And so this is where we make the recommendation that as part of any negotiated settlements amongst warring parties, there would be the deployment of an AU-led but international peacekeeping force with a very strong protection of civilians and human rights mandate. And then there are a whole range of other recommendations there where we are trying to push actors involved to ensure that individuals can one day safely return to their communities.
Thank you for that. We're going to come back to the peacekeeping call a bit later as well, because there's so many questions on that from people over the last couple of days. Fisaha, I think we have you back if you want to continue what you were saying about the methodology of this report, how we went about our research. You're muted. Can you hear us? Oh, there you go.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes. Please continue.
Okay. Thanks for the static earlier. Anyways, so in terms of methodology, it was very difficult for us to come up with this report because we were not able to go to the ground and conduct the investigation in person. And as we have said, we asked repeatedly for access, and those requests, both by HRW and Amnesty International, were not responded. So it took us a long time. We started in December 2020, and we did about 5 missions between the two organizations to go to Sudan and speak to testimonies from refugees in Sudan. In addition to that, we spoke to people on the ground by phone. Mainly Tigrayans displaced from Western Tigray, most of them in Tigray, and we did a lot of interviews, remote interviews with IDPs. In addition to that, we also spoke to the Amharans and the Walgite community members in Western Tigray. That's also mainly remotely. In general, we spoke to about 427 people, among which 409 of them were victims and witnesses, direct witness of the violations. The rest were people or who are present, especially from international humanitarian organizations or members of the humanitarian organizations on the ground, also journalists and other informed sources. But it's not only oral testimony of victims or experts. We also analyzed videos and photos. We verified them. We used satellite image to corroborate some of the visible allegations, like the indiscriminate shellings in different places of Western Tigray. One that stands out is the destruction of village around Dansha division settlements, where neighborhood number 1 and 2 were destroyed completely, and we were able to verify that video. So this is how we kind of interviewed. And so there was an internet communication, phone communication was largely restricted in Tigray and other parts of the country when there was a conflict. So it was not an easy undertaking to conduct an investigation in this context. But this is not the only case where we didn't have access. In previous cases also, we didn't have access to investigate in Ethiopia. So we have kind of developed a thorough methodology which allows us to document violations and corroborate our findings without direct access to areas where those violations have been committed. That is our methodology. Before publishing this report, we asked the federal government officials and also the Amhara officials and even the TPLF officials to respond to our key findings. It's only the Amhara regional government officials who responded, and they have not rebutted our findings in substance, but they just dismissed it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for explaining that. Another thing that we had an enormous number of questions on was, as I mentioned earlier, this our call by our two organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, for the deployment of an African Union-led international peacekeeping force to the Western Tigray zone. So, could Jean-Baptiste, we come back to you and maybe pick that up where Letitia left off and talk about that. Talk us through that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I mean, we did consider the various options that could lead to an increased protection for civilians in the area, which is really our main concern. And as Letitia said, we can't really wait for a resolution of either the Tigray conflict or the territorial dispute over Western Tigray, for civilians to be protected. The main issue is that the perpetrators of this ethnic cleansing, the Amhara special forces, the Fano militias, the other Amhara militias and Wolkate militias, are currently in control of the area. And so we believe that a neutral international peacekeeping force is, the best option to protect civilians despite its imperfections. And we believe that the African Union is best positioned to lead the process. And unfortunately, the African Union and the UN Security Council have shown inaction on the conflict. And we believe the EU should take its responsibilities in line with its charter, and the UN should support. So we think the force should be, international peacekeeping force should be EU-led, but international, and it should come, pending any consensual agreement between the warring parties. It should come as part of a consensual agreement among the parties. We also are calling for this force to have a strong mandate to protect civilians as well as the resources to do so. That should really be the main focus of the force.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to come back. I have a couple of questions on that, but I want to move on to the questions that we had from our audience. And another one that came up, Fisa, I'm going to give this to you, was about our determination that this was ethnic cleansing rather than genocide. A lot of people asked why we didn't make that determination, the determination of genocide, and called it ethnic cleansing. Could you explain what our reasoning is there?
Thanks, Andrew. That's a very which we have to understand is that whether it is genocide or crimes against humanity or war crime, they are international crimes punishable in international courts when available. So there is no hierarchy between these crimes. They are serious crimes. And so that we have to start with that. The other thing is that we have not said, coming to the question, we have not said this is ethnic cleansing instead of genocide, because that implies that we have ruled out genocide. No, we have not ruled out genocide. But based on the evidence we have, what we have is that crimes against humanity. By the way, ethnic cleansing is not an internationally recognized formal crime. But in order to cleanse an area from an ethnic group, violent means are used at large scale, which usually constitute crimes against humanity. So from the evidence we have collected, what comes out through is that the intention, as expressed by mainly the officials in the area, is that to drive out the Tigrayan residents, not to destroy them as ethnic group. So the overall intention of all this abuse, the extrajudicial execution, the mass detention, the sexual violence, deprivation of humanitarian assistance and relief, all these things, the whole purpose was to clean the area from Tigrayans. So they were more focused on driving out Tigrayans through abuses, through killings, through ethnically motivated slurs or ethnic slurs, or by terrorizing them, by intimidating them. But the main thing that comes out from the bulk of our evidence is that they want to drive them out. They want to change the demography of the area. So you can look at this. Your Tigrayans don't belong here. If you want to save your life, leave this area. And all those statements and also the pamphlets were saying that Tigrayans needs to leave that area. So the intention that come out is that they want to clean the area from Tigrayans. So based on the bulk of the information we have, individual soldiers or perpetrators might have said things against the Tigrayans, but for us to call it genocide, we need to see that from officials or from commanders at higher level of the command chain. So that's why we didn't say genocide based on our evidence. And I want to stress that we have not ruled out. Maybe subsequent on-ground investigations with better access might come up with that designation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Those are really, really important points, and ones we see in other conflicts, of course, as well, where people somehow think that if they can get a declaration that it is a genocide, then that is somehow going to be more impactful than these other crimes. But as you say, war crimes, crimes against humanity, it's bad enough. I mean, these are bad enough, and something needs to be done. Which brings us to our last question. Well, not last, actually. Just I have a couple more. Letitia, it's our next question. Why has the international community seemed to drop the ball on this? I mean, this is kind of is it? I mean, it can't be ignorance of what's going on. I think there's enough information that people know what's going on. Why is it just not enough attention, not enough action, not enough concern?
Yeah, I mean, what we document, as Fissa has just spelt out in this joint report, are just incredibly serious crimes, and we don't make these conclusions lightly. This requires concerted international action. And so, I mean, I would say we have on occasion seen important positive steps, notably at the Human Rights Council in December, where we saw global support for the establishment of an investigative mechanism to look into all the abuses since the beginning of the conflict in northern Ethiopia. But, the real what we have seen is that neither international nor regional responses have in any way remotely mirrored the scale of what has been unfolding in Western Tigray and northern Ethiopia writ large over the last year. Now, yes, I mean, as you ask, and as Fissa has spelt out, I mean, we have seen deliberate attempts by warring parties and notably the federal government to prevent real-time reporting. There is no question that in the first weeks of the conflict back in November 2020 and December 2020, there was very little information coming out. As we know, there is an ongoing restrictions on services in Tigray. So what does that mean? Is that visuals have not been coming out. I mean, when we traveled in our first trip to Sudan in December 2020, when refugees from Western Tigray were still able to flee, as Jean-Baptiste mentioned, that those routes have been by and large cut off by federal government forces and then Amhara regional forces. We expected to see people arriving with lots of visuals of what had been happening in those last weeks, photos on their phones. But no, if electricity is down, how do you take photos? And so, yes, we are talking about a conflict where there has been a deliberate attempt to prevent real-time reporting, to prevent the world from knowing what is going on. But that excuse is no longer. I mean, both our organizations, multiple media organizations have reported on the very serious crimes. So there really is no excuse. I mean, I think it's important to underline again, Ethiopia isn't even on the agenda of the UN Security Council or on the African Union Peace and Security Council. Just tomorrow, we're going to have yet another closed-door meeting on Ethiopia at the UN Security Council. And, it's absolutely key from our point of view that we hear not only much stronger messaging. I mean, at the moment, there's been a lot of emphasis on this humanitarian truce, which the government has declared. But, from our point of view, first of all, from an international humanitarian law point of view, allowing unhindered access is a responsibility of the warring parties, regardless of whether there is a truce in place. So, what we have been seeing are very serious crimes in themselves. But we need messaging, but we also need action. And I think this is, again, where, we have very specific recommendations around what needs to happen, what needs to be on the political agendas and discussions, and concrete actions which need to happen against specific individuals, but also specific warring parties as well. And it's very clear for us that, there can be no business as usual in Ethiopia, given what has been happening over the last 17 months. And I think, that is a message which the international and regional community, who have clearly again and again been very uncomfortable with raising what are these devastating crimes and realities which continue to date.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to turn back to something that was mentioned before about justice pathways to justice for these crimes that we've documented. What are the possible routes that we might see to get criminal justice for these actions and these atrocities? Fisa, do you want to come in here? Oops, we may have lost him again. Oh dear. Yes, I think we've lost him again. I do apologize. I don't know, Jean-Baptiste, if you want to, or Letitia, do you want to take that as well?
I can use this one.
There you are.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So we are sitting together.
You two are together, so you just grab Letitia's phone. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay,
yes. I was logged off and couldn't go back again.
Okay.
I mean, justice is a big issue in Ethiopia. There is this culture of impunity in Ethiopia for mass atrocities, serious and grave human rights violations that have been going on for decades. And the conflict in northern Ethiopia started in this situation where there is culture of impunity, lack of justice, and from our perspective, what we have documented in Western Tigray is also just the tip of the iceberg, because we didn't have access, as I've already said. And if we had proper access, we could have found out more evidence of grave human rights violations as part of this conflict. So in this context of culture of impunity, it is extremely difficult to imagine proper justice being rolled out for victims and for perpetrators to be held accountable. And also, I mean, the Ethiopian government was saying that they have conducted prosecutions and investigations. They have taken some of the perpetrators to a military court. But I want to stress that these military courts, their proceeding is not public. We don't know what they are charged of, the nature of the prosecution, and also the other remedies for victims are not available in those courts. So in this context, we need independent and impartial investigation first. And that's why we have been stressing again and again that the investigation mechanism established by the UN Human Rights Council needs to be given access, and they need to be able to give proper recommendation about the way forward in terms of accountability and also justice for victims. I mean, when we talk about justice, it's not only accountability. Victims also need compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, and all the package of reparation. So the justice mechanism needs to be proper, independent, and credible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Letitia, well, it's the same phone. Okay. Letitia, do you want to come in with some final thoughts? We're nearing the end of our discussion here, so why don't you try to consolidate all this together and bring it home for us?
I think that's quite difficult to do. I mean, obviously what we document are, months and months of incredibly serious abuses, and come out with these incredibly devastating findings. And this is obviously on the back of 17 months of reporting on these abuses in the conflict affected areas. And I think, final thoughts are there should be a global outcry for what has been happening. This cannot be ignored, and decision makers at all levels should be incredibly uncomfortable for not actually taking these incredibly serious abuses more more seriously. And I think it's important to say that, what happens in Tigray, what happens in northern Ethiopia will have repercussions on the whole of Ethiopia for years and years to come, but also in the region more broadly. And that is why it is incredibly important that there is a concerted international and regional response to what we are laying out in this report.
Thank you so much for that, Letitia. That's an excellent place to end it. I want to thank everyone for listening for the past hour or so, and I want to thank especially all of our speakers, Jean-Baptiste, Fista, and Letitia. Thank you very much, and thank you all for listening. We are obviously going to be keeping an eye on this. We will be continuing to report on this. Both, I can't speak for Amnesty International, but I think I can in this particular case to say that I know both our organizations are going to be continuing to follow this and this crisis and continuing to document what's happening there. And we will try our hardest to get the international community to do what needs to be done. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you again in another space at another time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks.
Thank you.